There was a certain amount of hubris and complacency after the first Gulf War in 1990-91. We're at such a technological level of advancement over all our rivals that we don't really need to pay a great deal of attention on investing further on this. And of course, at the same time, what their rivals were seeing was we need to catch up. So actually the Russians, the Chinese and others did begin investing severely then in their own aircraft and other military forces. They may not have necessarily caught up as a peer-for-peer competitor, but again, in terms of scale, quantity, the picture is more difficult now for the US going forward than it was even 10, 15 years ago. My name's Rob Singh. I'm Professor of Politics at Birkbeck, University of London. I work on, in particular, the politics of US foreign policy as well as domestic American politics. Yeah, I mean, the US Air Force is a tricky one because it is probably the most powerful in the world. The slightly complicating factor there is that a lot of the fleet is aging. And so what you're tending to find is that they date really from the Reagan era defense build-up in the 1980s. A lot of them now are actually having to basically be repaired using other aircraft's parts to keep them flying. So for the Pentagon in particular, there's a consistent push to try to spend more on new hardware, but it's in competition with the Army and the Air and the Navy and the Marines. Members of Congress are increasingly sceptical about these kind of claims. So over the longer term, it's not clear how long the States can keep its advantage going. The US is second to Russia in terms of the number of nuclear warheads that it has, but far and away ahead of all the other nuclear powers in the world. It also has a triad which is formidable, so nuclear submarines, land-based missiles and air-based missiles, which means that the deterrent is reliable. There's no danger that, let's say, a first strike by Russia on the land-based missiles will take out the entire arsenal. So at one level, in terms of the legacy of the Cold War, the US deterrent has been pretty effective in relation to first the Soviet Union, now to Russia and China. But it's also been effective in a sense that's more difficult for many people to gauge, or less visible for many people, which is it's maintained as best it can a broader non-proliferation. Because the United States will say to Japan, for instance, you are under our nuclear umbrella, so that if you were attacked by North Korea or China, we will defend you, we will respond. That has basically disincentivized the Japanese from themselves becoming an independent nuclear state. John F. Kennedy, for example, towards the end of his presidency in 1963, predicted that by 1970 there would probably be 25 or maybe 40 nuclear powers in the world. Well, fortunately, there are only 9 currently. And a large amount of the credit for that, I think, does have to go to Washington for simply saying, look, there's no need for you to do this because we will protect you. The way in which America's power on the nuclear dimension is viewed is often seen as something of a caricature. Oh, it's got nuclear weapons and that's a threat to the rest of the world. Well, arguably it's been crucial to deterrence, to non-proliferation. And if it was not there, or if it broke down, we would be in a far more unstable order. The US Navy has just over around about 300 ships. Largest aircraft carrier fleet, I think, is 11 now. And that means that it's basically able to project power around the world in ways that no other state can do. There's no other state that's comparable there, although China has more ships now by a margin, about 500, 600 even. the quality of the US Navy is singular, and it means that it's been able to keep free trade routes for goods open, mean that other states have been able to free ride on that guarantee of those sea trade routes being open. And it's essentially been an asset for the US to be able to be nimble in terms of its international responses. So if there is a particular threat that arises, let's say around North Korea, the US can actually dispatch an aircraft carrier group there to try and ratchet down the threat in ways that no other state can manage. When you look to China, Russia, India, they've tried to sort of copycat each other in terms of the development of their naval forces. They just don't have the originality in terms of technology and production facilities and so forth that the US has. The US also has the advantage in essence of experience that it's gone to war on several occasions, and so it's battle ready, it's operational, its actual personnel know what the experience of war is like. And when you're dealing with other states where they tend to be conscripted armed forces rather than volunteer ones, that can make a real difference in terms of an actual operation, I think. There's a question mark over the army in the sense that one, its numbers are going down. So this year, for instance, it's not been able to hit its recruitment targets, and there are all kinds of questions as to why that is. Some explanations are basically just saying that younger Americans either aren't interested in joining, they're too obese. Some are being turned off by what is being characterized as woke tenets now featuring in the Army's own instruction manuals and so forth. It's still a very powerful force, but as we saw over the Afghan and the Iraqi campaigns, a lot of its power stems on what it's being asked to do. So it's very good at destroying things. It's just not really made for stabilization or for nation or state building. I think you can make an argument that says the US Army is still, in terms of the kinds of caliber of people that it recruits and its flexibility, it's pretty nimble and it's pretty effective in those terms, but it doesn't have the numbers for serious nation building on the ground. US military spending in the aggregate sounds huge. It's roughly now somewhere in the region of $760 billion a year. And that doesn't include some operations which are not officially accounted for. So in reality, it's probably in the region of $800–900 billion. The common critique of the United States is to look at the annual defense budget and say, look, they're spending so much more than, let's say, than the next 8 largest military spenders combined. And all of that money could be, or a large proportion of that money could be better used domestically in the United States. They're spending that much more than the next great powers combined because they uniquely have global responsibilities. Although the expenditure seems incredibly large, having 10 or 11 aircraft carriers is a way to guarantee freedom of the seas, which is crucial for international trade, for example. In proportionate terms, it's not really that much. It's about now just over 3% of GDP in the United States. So because the overall economy is so large, actually defense spending proportionately is not that much. About half of that expenditure is going on things like veterans benefits, very generous provision for healthcare for the armed forces. So things that actually are not directly contributing to platforms or advantages for the American military when it comes to actual combat there. I think on balance, the US has the advantage when it comes to innovation militarily. The problem that it's had over recent years is that China in particular has been very good at espionage. And so when the US develops a new weapon system, for example, the Chinese quickly get hold of the design and imitate it. Nonetheless, it's still the case, I think, broadly speaking, that the US defense sector, universities, think tanks, and so forth, together are at a qualitatively different level of expertise than any other in the world, and that continues to be the case. So for the short to medium term, I think you can expect that status quo will endure, but a lot of that does depend on issues such as investment, for example. The US during the Cold War was more than happy to pour millions and millions of dollars into investment here, not so keen any longer. And also, if you look at the defence industrial base in the United States, for instance, a lot of the military weaponry that it's been supplying to Ukraine is not getting quickly replaced in the US because its industrial base has decayed since the 2000s. So it would need to revive that quite considerably to be, confident of maintaining a qualitative military edge over its competitors. The rough estimate of the number of US bases around the world now is about 800. Now you put the UK, France and Russia together in terms of bases that they've got outside of their own homelands, it adds up to about 30. It enables them to project power, but it also ties other states into what the US sees as being in its own interest, but in others' interest too. But it also gives the US a certain flexibility. So, for instance, the US left Afghanistan in August of 2021 and left it in a, abominable fashion. Nonetheless, you saw this summer that they're still able to operate drones from bases in the Gulf that can go and assassinate terror leaders when they identify them in Afghanistan. So the global footprint that those bases give and the power that it enables the US to exercise is huge. If you didn't know about any state in the world and you were simply asked in advance, well, which one would you choose to be the safest in, you choose America. So traditionally it's been extremely difficult to attack. You've got to project naval power to even get close. Now with cyber attacks, the US is more vulnerable than it used to be. But again, it's still, incomparably stronger than so almost all other states in the world that are surrounded by neighbours with whom they have either gone to war previously or had hostile relations of some sort. Even if you take large states like China and Russia, India, they've all gone to war with their neighbours and they still have major tensions with neighbouring states. And the US is just not in that position. So it's given it an advantage in the sense of deterrence that you haven't really needed to think too seriously about being attacked. But also then the knock-on effect of that is it becomes easier to project power if you think, well, we don't need to invest in a very large army to protect us at home when we're essentially okay, we're secure. We can devote those resources to actually naval resources and projecting power around the world. So it's a fundamental advantage that endures. In the US itself, there's become increasing question about its foreign policy because the benefits of what the US has been doing are not as obvious as the failings in foreign policy. The logic of America's strategy has been to say that we don't want on any of the key regions of the world, which for Washington is basically Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. We don't want a situation arising, which had happened previously, where one major regional power could threaten to dominate that region. By developing alliances and partnerships in those regions, we are able to make sure that we play a balancing and a pacifying role. If the United States had not been present, or was not present now, in these regions, the chances of military conflict breaking out would be much greater than they've otherwise been. So what it's been able to do is essentially been to raise the costs for any particularly ambitious or aggressive states of them actually going to war with any of their neighbours. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have not seen major great power war since 1945, when we saw it so often and to such dramatic cost. And it's difficult, in my view, to get away from the explanation being the overall dominance of the United States in the international system and its alliances. There's certainly no question that the gap has reduced hugely since the end of the Cold War, but at the moment the gap is narrowing literally month by month, year by year, and that's probably likely to continue in the sense that China has made so many advances on some of the cutting-edge technologies. It's become the leading trade partner, for example, for most of the nations in Latin America. And that inevitably is having an effect on diplomatic relations as well then. So there is potential for the world order to become, rather than a liberal one, an imperfectly liberal one, to become a much more illiberal one in which authoritarian states, with China in the lead, begin to rewrite the rules of international engagement. How likely that is open, I think, to question, because China has a large number of internal problems that perhaps don't get sufficient attention. So that the more that it has risen and tried to assert itself, even in the Pacific region, the more that other states from South Korea, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and so forth have pushed back and tilted a little bit further in Washington's direction. There's also no inevitability that America will continue, firstly, to want to play the leading role that it's played for several decades. If Donald Trump were to return to the White House in January 2025, or a Trump-like Republican would do so, then essentially all bets are off. And it's possible that the US might then again become much more insular, much less willing to be engaged internationally, certainly not to be leading military interventions abroad. And that in itself will create vacuums in, for example, the Middle East, in Asia, that China would probably be keen on filling. I think that when most people think about the states and power, it tends to be in very narrowly military-based terms, and that the US has for decades now had a unique ability to project military power around the globe, unlike any other state. That, to me, is really only a partial part of the explanation for the staying power of the US as the premier power in the world. And a lot of the strength of the United States, even after Trump, is its soft power. In essence, soft power is really the ability to get others to want what you want. And the US, since 1945, if not earlier, has been extraordinarily successful in achieving that. The US has been, for all of its flaws, a country to be worthy of admiration and emulation, and in many ways. And in that sense, I think its attractiveness has been a very underrated source of its overall power. Soft power is not something really that governments can easily utilise. It tends to be much broader and more diffuse about, do you like the way that this society looks? So the classic example here is during the Cold War, that states in Europe, Asia, Africa and elsewhere, that the Soviet Union and the United States were vying to attract to their side of the conflict. When it came to soft power, the Soviet Union really didn't have anything. Whereas Europeans and others, when they looked to America, they loved its movies, its clothing, its fashion, its music, all of these elements that they found attractive about the States. That wasn't something that could easily be manipulated by governments, but it did help them. You know, you've seen major inflows legally and of course large-scale illegal immigration too. That's kept the average American age relatively low, and it's replenished the workforce. So you've got a very large tax-paying base. You've got a relatively young population, in contrast to most of the rest of the world now, where the demographics are tilting much more heavily towards elderly populations with a relatively small base of younger workers having to take on a bigger tax burden to pay for the welfare benefits. I think there's also a difference in terms of identity. Now, this is a fraught subject now, because there are a lot of skeptics about the traditional view. But the traditional view has been that America has been attractive and has been able to renew itself because anybody around the world can become American, regardless of nationality, creed, race, ethnicity, religion, and so forth. And that has been a beacon attracting people to the United States. However much it's a myth, or however much the myth is not fully validated by reality, it's a very powerful myth. There's no question in my mind that the US economy is still the most important in the world, partly because of having the dollar still as the reserve currency. And for all of the weaknesses that occur in the US, that's still, you know, a key element in sustaining its global power. It can print money, it can rely on other nations to buy up its debt, and no other entity, whether it's been China or the EU with the euro, they've had years and years where they've predicted that they will eclipse the dollar, and it's never happened. People always go to where they think the safest currency is. Also, I think over recent years, you've seen elements in terms of the fracking revolution which have fundamentally altered the context. So you go from the US being a net importer of oil to now being the largest oil and gas producer and exporter in the world. So all of the kind of traditional strengths that the US had in terms of what writers have termed a free security, you know, very difficult to attack, bounded geographically by two large oceans, largely friendly neighbours, you know, basically secure and having huge domestic resources. That's even more so, I think, today. It is essentially self-sufficient. Were you to cut, you know, were global trade simply to collapse tomorrow, everyone would be worse off, but the states would be in the most advantageous position. I don't think there's any question, even today, that the United States is the most powerful state in the world by some distance. That's not to say it's number one on every possible metric of power, and there are a lot of scholars who would suggest that on some of those China has now overtaken the US. But if you look to the overall spectrum of power, who's really ahead on the whole dimensions of these metrics that we're talking about of power, then the States is still there. China actually spends a huge amount of its resources on internal repression, on a police state, and on welfare benefits to keep its population quiet in a way that the United States does not. Add on top of that, that there are very few people who are trying to get in to China, and there are millions, legally and illegally, still trying to get into the United States. And it means that in terms of demographics, the States also has a relatively young population. Really, in terms of the great powers, the only other one that's comparable is India. So they're growing, they're renovating, and in terms of things like, for example, research and development, again, the States has the leading universities, has the leading research institutes, it develops more patents, more Nobel Prizes than anyone else. So I think put all together, you've got easily the strongest nation in the world.
Russia has the world's most significant nuclear capability. Russia's nuclear capability is predominantly land-based. Both Russia and the United States maintain the so-called triad, so they have nuclear weapons and delivery systems across the three military domains of land, sea and air. Russia is more of a land base. It's the world's principal land-based nuclear power. Well, it's not just a coincidence that numerically Russia has more nuclear weapons than anybody else. Land-based missiles are potentially vulnerable to preemptive first strike because they're fixed. It's easier to find out where they are and they're more difficult to move. So we guard against that, the threat of preemptive, a disarming first strike in the jargon, by having basically so many of them. The US could take out 90% of Russia's land-based intercontinental ballistic missile capability. And Russia could launch the remaining 10%, and then the US could, through its ballistic missile defense technologies, eliminate half of that. But 5% of Russia's strategic nuclear inventory landing on US population centers is something that is still absolutely unthinkable. That's the essence of deterrence. And that, in a nutshell, simply put, is the essence of Russian nuclear thinking. It means, number one, that Russia itself can never be directly attacked by any other state, including the United States, NATO, or China. Do you need this complex and sophisticated mix of enough on the land, enough in the air, and then enough under the sea as well, which is the basis of US nuclear planning and strategy? I don't think you do, because I think nuclear deterrence works just as well from the Russian perspective as it does from the US perspective. And I think we can see that very clearly in the Ukraine context. Now, nobody that I'm aware of, certainly not in the public domain, amongst Western governments, is even remotely seriously contemplating escalating support for Ukraine to a level where there's even the remote possibility of any kind of Russian nuclear use and Russian nuclear response. So Russia has got more than enough to deter, is the bottom line. My name is Dr. Martin Smith, and I'm a lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. This is Russia's true power. Russia doesn't really have a significant blue water naval capability, i.e. no way can the Russian Navy establish and sustain a global maritime presence in any way comparable to what the United States is currently doing, and what China perhaps increasingly aspires to begin to do. So I think amongst those big three, in military terms, in the maritime domain, Russia is, relatively speaking, the poor relation. It's the least powerful of the three main branches of the Russian armed forces. It's been relatively neglected compared to the Air Force and the Army. So you hear these stories about the Admiral Kuznetsov, for example, Russia's aircraft carrier. When it undertakes a significant deployment, it has to have basically a couple of support ships exclusively carrying spare parts because it breaks down so frequently. And the very fact that, compared to the United States, which currently has 11 fully equipped carrier battle groups, so aircraft carriers and appropriate supporting vessels. At the moment, the Russian Navy has just the one. China has two and is in the process of building a third, as I understand it. I think traditionally, Russia is a land power, just because of its, well, for two reasons, because of its sheer size and its mass, which is, in power terms, you could argue is both an asset and a vulnerability. It's vulnerability because it has literally thousands of miles of borders in the east, and in the west, bordering European countries as well. Historically, the great concern of Russian leaders and military planners has been the perception of vulnerability from the West. So the emphasis traditionally, and this is not just sort of military planning, this arguably has seeped into sort of Russian cultural views about its vulnerability and its what is needed to defend itself and to preserve Russia as a viable state and society. You need a strong mass army. So even if you're facing states and armies which may technologically be more sophisticated than you are, you can ultimately, and it might be brutal, it might be bloody, it might be grinding, but eventually, due to mass, due to the assistance from General Winter, the Russian Winter, and due to the sheer size of the country, you will beat them back and you will prevail. But to do that, you need a mass army, not just a mass deployable, mobilizable army, but you need essentially infinite reserves that you can throw into the fight if necessary. Russia is one of the world's principal military spenders. Its annual defence budget is consistently in the top 10 of global military spending. It's also a significant arms exporter, not least to China. So measured on that basis, Russia, in quantitative hard power terms, Russia is globally speaking one of the world's most significant hard powers. It varies because levels of defence spending vary, but roughly around the fifth or sixth largest defence spender in the world. The United States is consistently, by some distance, the world's largest. I think there's technology, the SU range of aircraft that are comparable in quality. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they leave the US in the shade and US military developers and technicians wish that they had something like that. But they're certainly considered to be on a par, as are some of the more modern Russian tanks as well. So I think the issue with the Russian weaponry is not its lack of technological sophistication and quality, but the relatively ineffective use to which it's been put. I would say that this has been arguably Mr. Putin's greatest achievement. Let me try and justify that. When he took over, very last day of the old millennium, so December 31st, 1999, when he was basically appointed president by Boris Yeltsin, he issued basically a manifesto, we would call a manifesto, so a core statement of his beliefs about what was wrong with Russia at that time and what was required in order to bring Russia back. And so Mr. Putin's basic argument in 1999 is the only way to get the show back on the road and to hold this thing together is by reconstituting, that's an important point, reconstituting a strong, centralised state authority. So what we, and of course the word we often use in the West is authoritarian regime, which to us, from our perspective, that's what Mr. Putin's system of governance looks like. Without seeking to justify that in any way, the point I would make is it's been effective. It has brought Russia back. It has provided, if you compare Russia today, in terms of the internal and domestic picture, with Russia for most of the 1990s, before Mr. Putin came to power, then it is far stronger, more cohesive, and more effective. And the government, and this surprises many Westerners as well, has enjoyed durable popularity. Internationally, Does the Putin system have any real soft power clout? No, I would say. But domestically, I think substantially and durably so. The essence of Russia's hard power are its hydrocarbon exports. The fact that it is one of the most significant, in fact the most significant exporter of gas in the world, and has amongst the most significant reserves of oil and gas as well. So as long as those are absolutely pivotal to the global economy, that is going to be a solid core revenue generator for the Russian government to be able to spend, well, as it sees fit, but to spend a significant percentage of that on maintaining its military, its conventional and its nuclear capability. So as long as that stays the case, then Russia possesses core economic strength. If that progressively ceases to be the case, or if there is a significant global shift away from dependence on hydrocarbons in favour of dependence on renewables, then that could be bad news for Russia's economic base. And because this is the base of Russia's hard power per se, that would be bad news for Russia's hard power. The impact of that is going to be measured in years, perhaps decades, rather than months. So for the foreseeable future, Russia's hard power base, as I see it, is going to remain substantially intact. What is Russia's rightful role in the Putinist view? Two things. It's a great power, which means that it is a globally significant player. Not the only one, but one of the leading global power centres. And so the other core element of Putinism has been this stress on what's called multipolarity. In a multipolar world order, there are three or more globally significant power centres. The great bugbear for Mr. Putin and his supporters is the American scheme to maintain a unipolar world order, i.e. a world order centred around the status of the United States as top dog. It's not that Russia wants to be top dog, it wants to create a unipolar Russian world, but it's opposed to unipolarity per se. Russia is rightfully a leading power centre and expects to be regarded as such and expects to be treated as such by the United States and others. When it doesn't feel it's being treated that way, that's when there have been problems, in Mr. Putin's view. The big one, in terms of structural power, traditionally, for Soviet and Russian governments, was the United Nations, because since 1945 the Soviet Union / Russia has had the built-in institutional role of being one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council with the right of veto. Russian leaders, up to and including Mr. Putin, have always stressed the pivotal role that the United Nations should play as the preeminent global security institution. So essentially, big decisions pertaining to international peace and security should not be taken and actioned other than through the UN. Anything else is illegal and illegitimate. So to that extent, Russian leaders have also traditionally consistently stressed the importance of international law, particularly when it comes to the use of armed force. One of the significant things, and I think I'm surprised this hasn't garnered more attention so far, is the extent to which Mr. Putin has seriously undermined traditional Russian claims about the supremacy of the United Nations and international law. Article 2, paragraph 4 of the UN Charter quite clearly says that it is illegal for any state to use or to threaten to use armed force against the sovereignty, territory, or independence of any other state. For any reason. There's no read further on, and there's 2 or 3 get-outs, that is a blanket prohibition. Does this tell us, potentially, something about Russian views of the diminishing utility of structural power? If Russian leaders previously felt the need to refer regularly to the UN international law, remind people of Russia's core status on the Security Council, and it was the Westerners who were illegally intervening in places like Kosovo or Iraq, who were weakening that. Now it's Russia itself which is illegally intervening and not even trying to dress it up within any sort of legal justificatory framework. Does this mean that Mr. Putin has, if you like, gone beyond the point of no return and accepted, okay, Russia's status at the UN may well never recover from this because it's been so flagrant, but actually we don't care? And that would be, it seems to me, quite a significant departure for a Russian leader, if that indeed proves to be the case. You need a big resource base in order to sustain yourself as a power. That's not enough in itself. It's not a guarantee because it depends on how you use those resources, etc., etc. But you need to have a significant resource base. And if you look at the great powers in the world today, the United States, China, India, perhaps sort of coming up on the rails. Brazil in the Latin American context, what do they all have in common? They are geographically big countries with relatively large populations. Great powers are big powers, and therefore being by landmass the biggest country in the world, that in itself is enough at a basic level to make people sit up and take notice. It's unique because it has borders on the one side with China, and on the other side with members of NATO and the European Union. That gives Russia the basis for claiming to be involved and claiming we have a right to a say here. We are an Asian power. We have a 1,000-kilometre plus border with China. That makes us an Asian power. Just as Russia has a western border, as you say, with a number of members of NATO and the European Union. So Russia is a leading factor in the European security equation. The main cons are having so many, such extensive land borders with so many different states that presents perpetual vulnerabilities. So at the moment, Russian relations with China are pretty good. That hasn't always been the case. That might not always be the case in the future. They came to blow the late 1960s, the USSR and Maoist China actually came to blows militarily. Not through fighting a major war, but there were military exchanges amongst the disputed border. To this day, the Russo-Chinese border remains the longest undemarcated border in the world. They haven't finally and definitively agreed where the borderline should be drawn. So there's always the potential for relations to worsen as a result of border. So size is at one and the same time in power terms both an asset but also a source of enduring vulnerability. Russia's overseas military footprint is small. It's not non-existent, but it's small compared to the United States. But then again, compared to the United States, every other country in the world has a small overseas military footprint. China, for example, currently only has one overseas military base in Djibouti. Russia has about 8 at the moment, mainly in countries adjacent to itself, so other former Soviet states, such as Georgia, for example, the so-called, many Russians have referred to as the near abroad countries, and a couple in Syria as well. So it has a small, limited footprint, but I think from the Russian perspective, it's important. I think there is a substantial basis for arguing that, depending on how you understand the concept of ally, Russia actually doesn't have any allies. That doesn't mean There aren't states with which Russia has, important states with which Russia has friendly relations which have been identified as relations of partnership. China is the principal one. Officially, Russia and China have a strategic partnership, in inverted commas. So it has friendly relations. It has what we in the West would refer to and do refer to as client states, such as Belarus, but it doesn't have allies. What's an ally? Well, an ally, in terms of modern diplomatic usage, is a term that's used to describe the arrangements amongst NATO member states. Ultimately, a NATO ally is a state to which other NATO members are contractually obliged to assist if it's attacked by a non-member state. So the ultimate commitment, that's what the essence of alliance is. So there's no other state in the world which has signed an agreement saying if Russia is attacked, we will regard that as being tantamount to an attack on our own sovereignty, our own territory, and we will act on that basis. And conversely, of course, it works both ways. Russia hasn't given that kind of commitment to any other state. So what it means, and I think you can see what it means in practice in the Ukraine context. There was a lot of assumptions were made in the West, and I suspect also in Russia, that at the very least, Belarus would be committing troops on the ground in Ukraine in support of the Russian special military operations since February. That has not happened. The Belarusian government, yes, rhetorical support, and I think there have been some training of Russian troops and opportunities for rest and recuperation of Russian forces being rotated out of Ukraine. But in terms of putting their own blood and treasure on the line in support of Russia in Ukraine, even the state which you might regard, if there's one exception to the rule I've just outlined for you there, it might be Belarus. You might say, well, Belarus is, to all intents and purposes, a Russian ally. But is it? Because it hasn't actually, in any significant way, at the risk of any significant cost to itself, it's not actually stepped up to help its ally out in a neighbouring state. Because, of course, Belarus shares a border with Ukraine, as does Russia. It's always a challenging one because it's intangible and it's linked to those other great military intangibles, morale. But you've got plenty of stories of Russian troops in Ukraine being reluctant to fight, stories of desertion, occasional stories of their turning on their own commanders, giving themselves up, selling tanks to the Ukrainian army for a few $1,000s. All of these stories. But I think the most significant is how many of the Russian troops who were sent to Ukraine were not told where they were going, at least why they were going there. They were told they were going on an exercise close to the border of Ukraine, or they were going into Ukraine as part of the exercise, having been invited by fraternal Russian leaders. They weren't actually told that they were taking part in a war against another sovereign state and its government. The will to fight on the Ukrainian side has completely surprised both the Russian political elite and Russian military commanders. And also, I would suggest, it has surprised a lot of people in the West as well. Russian power is overly monodimensional. There's too much emphasis on the hard. The famous quote from Barack Obama after the first Russian intervention in Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, when people, I think, asked this sort of question.
Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness.
So by saying Russia is merely a regional power, what he was quite clearly saying to those in the know, if you like, is Mr. Putin's claims about great power status for Russia just don't add up, just don't stack up. It doesn't have what it takes across the domain of power capabilities.
The Chinese army has been going through